Well, we had another television, I'm tempted to call it a soap opera, but perhaps will not, television extravaganza this week with Judge Bork on the stand, answering questions, including some rather silly ones, I thought. And so I think the question now, he is finished as of Saturday. Did he change any minds? Did he improve his chances to be approved for the Supreme Court? George, what do you think?
Well, there are two separate questions, David. How did he do? I think he did well in the sense that his job there was to show that he was a thoughtful person, all of whose positions have been taken in the past at some point or other by major, eminent, respectable thinkers in the American jurisprudential tradition. Did he change minds is another question, because it's not clear how many of those minds on that committee were changeable. I see in the paper this morning that Howard Metzenbaum of Ohio, the senator, says that Judge Bork's views frighten him. Other people were probably frightened at the spectacle of Howard Metzenbaum trying and manifestly failing to follow fairly clear arguments.
I think he changed minds. He was speaking, he said, for the women of the United States, of whom there are, 150 million? I wonder how many of them he's really talked to.
Beats me.
Sam, what?
Well, I think Judge Bork came across about as both sides had pictured him earlier. The president nominated him, and we saw a man there who knows the law, who is an intellectual, who seems to be a reasonable person in the way he speaks and articulates his view of how to interpret the Constitution and the legislatures that pass the law. But on the other hand, we saw Judge Bork very honestly telling us that he believes that unless there are these antecedent things that can be found about the Constitution or legislative intent, that judges should not in any way do anything further. And while he says, well, no, I won't repeal the use of the Commerce Clause or the fact we now print money, he didn't make the same argument on Roe versus Wade or on the modern decisions that people care about. And I think everyone has a right to expect that he would,
I thought
in an appropriate case, reverse.
If he presented a changed mind, it was his own. He walked in, and with 20 years history behind him of criticizing the major Supreme Court decisions in terms of individual rights, and he came in and he said, some of my best friends actually are women's rights, and some of my best friends are civil rights. It was like watching The Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. It was really fairly startling in that sense.
I think Ellen is having the dilemma of the Metzenbaum-Biden-Kennedy faction, which is they can't decide why they're against Bork. They know they're against him, but is it because he's an inflexible ideologue or because he changes his mind?
No, I'm against. When I listened to him, I thought, I am against the original Bork. The original one is presented by his writings. What struck me was that he tried to present a highly modified version of that person.
I don't think that's fair. Judge Bork said quite clearly, and I think persuasively, that there is a distinction to be drawn between the way one writes and reasons and argues when you are teaching a seminar and the way you do it when you're in a courtroom. Because, he said, in a seminar no one gets hurt, and in a courtroom someone always gets hurt. And I think that speaks, Sam, to your point, which is he did talk about the gravity and the prudential and statesmanlike considerations that go into carrying an intellectual position to a point where, when you're making public policy, you do overturn a settled precedent. I think he did make
let's take the abortion decision. Judge Bork says that he's not necessarily passing on the question of abortion, but the fact that he believes the court in that decision did not have the right to find a right of privacy. He cannot find that in the Constitution. And so he was asked, well, can you find some other construction that would allow you to reach the same end? Well, he said, I don't know whether I can or can't. And I think the women of this country have every right to believe that given what he says at seminars, given what he says when he talks, and he's the same articulate person that he is on the bench, is he not, George?
Sure, too.
Well, given that, let me just finish this sentence. They have a right to believe that, no, he wouldn't be able to find it, and if you get 4 other votes, and we know they are on the court, he'd reverse.
Oh, I don't
you have a right to believe that, particularly since we all know that he wouldn't have been nominated if he didn't believe that. I mean, we're now trying to present him as somebody who would horrify his supporters.
I do not believe there are 4 other votes on the court for the repeal of Roe v. Wade. I do not believe you can establish that overturning Roe v. Wade, all that would do is restore to the states their traditional right to regulate abortions. Whereas, in fact, even by 1973, states with 41% of the United States population had begun to liberalize their abortion laws. Every poll indicates the argument's over and won by the pro-choice movement. There isn't a state in the Union.
Do you remember
that
the
would
decisions and the votes on those decisions in this matter in recent years?
Yeah, I do indeed, and not one of them presents the issues that would be at stake in a stark repeal
Yes,
of Roe
but
v.
it
Wade.
prevents a
Well, the
divided
issues
court
you would
on
be
this very
able
question.
to, for example, you would be able to regulate it, make it impossible, if not illegal. That would be one of the options if you did turn over. There are a lot of options that would come up in the next series of decisions before the court. But one thing that was interesting is how little Roe v. Wade came up in these hearings, when we all know it was at stake.
There was an interesting point that Bork made, which I thought was wrong. He said he cannot find the right of privacy in the Constitution. Well, you can't find that phrase. But in the amendments saying that people are secure in their homes or effects, their papers, so on.
Ah, but that's a different type of privacy to Judge Bork.
Isn't that privacy? You're entitled to
for
privacy,
papers
and the
and
cops
for
cannot
possession.
come busting in unless they have
Do
a
you
warrant.
remember where William Douglas found that right? He said it is a penumbra that is an emanation from rights. That's
you
where
see,
he found it.
George,
Well,
Judge
that's
Bork
very
is
nice if I
perfectly
knew what it
possible.
meant.
It was good. Judge Bork says, I don't quite know what that means. That's all he's
Well, I
saying.
know, but I-
Whizzer White, who sits on the court, agreed with him. Potter Stewart, the late Potter Stewart, would have dissented in Roe v. Wade because he couldn't find it either. He just said, well, we made the mistake in Griswold. Let's just carry on with it.
But he can find radio and television as something modern the framers knew nothing about, and very sensibly say, well, of course the First Amendment must be extended, even though the framers haven't a word in there about This Week with David Brinkley. But when it comes to the right
That
of
was one of their
privacy,
oversights.
the framers talked about papers and possessions, but he can't extend that to the person. And if you convince women of this country that their possessions can be safeguarded because of privacy, but not their persons, then you'll do something that even
be a
Judge
very
Bork,
hard
with all of his
sell.
elocution and eloquentness, cannot.
Well, how about the way the hearing was run? Was Biden has declared himself against Bork before the hearing ever began. Was he fair about it? Did he do a good job? Sam, what do you think?
A lot of people think I agree. From what I saw, I didn't see all of the hearing. He seemed to bend over backwards to be fair to Orrin Hatch and to people who are Judge Bork's
I thought
defenders.
he was personally very much shaken at times and weakened. He wasn't the Biden you've seen before because of his own problems last week.
He's had very severe problems about his speechifying.
That's another
Plagiarism
question.
people have accused him of. He had to call a press conference and explain it and say that he hadn't really done anything of any seriously wrong. You agree with that, George?
Well, there were two questions. One is that plagiarism in law school. I do believe a statute of limitations does run out on those things, and we should forget that. And what seems to me is problematic and disturbing to people about his appropriation of other people's rhetoric is that it's not the words he's appropriating, it's the passion he's appropriating. And it makes him seem a synthetic man, sopping up secondhand emotions from other people. Now, in an age where every candidate has speechwriters, I don't believe anyone wrote Jefferson's speeches, I may be wrong, but it's hard to tell at what point Bobby Kennedy actually belonged to the words that were written for him that now Senator Biden is not appropriately footnoting.
Well, George, you're right, because they all use others' words. I mean, Ronald Reagan came to the office by talking about a shining city on the hill. Well, that wasn't his phrase. It was someone else's earlier on. But I think that's fair.
Governor Bradford.
But Biden comes over, and he says, in using Neil Kinnock's words about a platform on which to stand and a generation that didn't go to college, he said, I was thinking on the way over here. Now, that's a little too much, because, as you point out, what's behind the words? What's there? And a lot of people, the rap on Biden has always been that it's just a surface.
Yeah, he's always been somebody who fell in love with the sound of what we thought were his own words. He's always had that weakness, and now comes in the little snicker factor, which I just emphasize. We thought they were his own words. I think his problem, too, is that most people didn't know who he was. Joe Biden, and now they're going to say, oh, yeah, he's the guy who plagiarized. That's
a lot of
their
people.
first. Politically, that's devastating.
All right, now the only woman member of the Reagan cabinet, Elizabeth Dole, Secretary of Transportation, announced she was resigning to help her husband run for president. Now, is that the way things ought to happen in this country, Ellen?
Well, I think it's great for Bob Dole. In some ways, they were the penultimate, Washington power couple, and they had that image of being perhaps the only Republican sharing couple in the public light, and he gets it both ways. He gets all the positive value of having the successful, highly visible woman who helps him do fundraisers like crazy, and at the same time, he gets now a full-time political wife, and that's really having it both ways.
I don't see
He gets
anything
it
wrong
all.
with that, Ellen. I mean, only one person in a marriage at any one time can run for president. I think someday there'll be a woman president, maybe many. And I don't see anything wrong at the time that a woman is running for office, if her husband is a member of the cabinet, that he resigns to campaign for her.
I look forward to that day.
Well, so I mean,
I think there was another thing. I mean, I think there's another point, too. I mean, Lily Dole kind of had to quit before a lot of planes started crashing into each other during the midst of the primaries.
Well, I think Elizabeth Dole's record on safety, I think actually she is one of the few people in government who can point and say, I, through my actions on 21-year-old drinking and safety in cars, has saved thousands of lives personally. I think it's a terrific record. But with regard to leaving, I thought the logic of the feminist position was to expand the range of choices that would not be stigmatized when women made them. Elizabeth Dole made a choice.
Absolutely.
Why now? Now a lot of people come out of the woodwork and say she didn't make the right choice. It's not sort of symbolically resonant.
Oh, no, I think she did. She had the right to make a choice. It's clear that she'd like to be in the White House, too. I wasn't criticizing her choice in that sense, although I believe he had the larger choices. She had the range of choice. What would have happened if
he had the larger choices because he's clearly an eligible presidential candidate?
If she had done the opposite?
You mean
if she had stayed in office, I think she would have also been criticized on that. She may be getting it both ways.
It may be very ironic. If Bob Dole doesn't get the nomination, it is quite possible that whoever does will choose Elizabeth Dole as his running mate. Well, and she may get to November, and he won't.
We can't settle it today, Sam. The time is up, but thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody. Nice to have you with us, Ellen. We'll be back with a few words from the presidential campaign front, where they do indeed have their problems, in a moment.